Hi, in this video, we're going to do a walkthrough for the example in Chapter 11. In Chapter 11, we're conducting a brand audit to see how consumers perceive our retailer brand relative to several other brands. So we went out and we got survey data from 100 consumers, and they evaluated our retailer brand relative to 5 other retailer brands on a number of different dimensions that we think are relevant. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the analysis in R and present the results and think about how that might impact how we might make decisions based on people's perceptions of our retailer. So let's start by going over into R and running the analysis. So we're going to open the file from Chapter 11. That's called factor analysis. So factor analysis will be the tool that we use for this example, where we're going to try and see whether or not there exists some set of latent factors that help us identify people's perceptions about our retailer brand. So the first step, as always, is to look for any packages we need to install. In this case, there are several packages we're going to install so that we can both run the analysis as well as visualize some of the results here in R. So let's go ahead and highlight the packages to install and hit run. I'll just select the cloud to download. So now we have all of the packages downloaded. Let's go ahead and load the libraries of the packages and set our random number generating seed. Okay, so now we should be ready to run the analysis. In step 1, we want to bring in the data. This is the survey data of the 100 consumers times 6 different retailers, our retailer, as well as 5 other retailers. So let's go ahead and select Chapter 11, and we want the retailer survey. Again, if we want to see the data, at least a little bit of the data, we can click over into the console window and type head. In this case, the data table is called retailer survey. And we see here that these are the ratings that the first 6 respondents gave for our brand, Chestnut Ridge, our retailer brand, on all of these different dimensions. And these things include quality, whether or not the clothing we sell will last, does it fit well, is it the latest clothing, following trends, stylish, and so on, all the way to outcome measures like whether they're satisfied, whether they might purchase again or purchase in the first place, and their willingness to recommend our brand. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look just at what we would call the descriptive statistics. The descriptive statistics are just going to be the averages of these different items for each retailer. So in this section, when we run this, we're going to see that for each of the 6 retailers, so A, B, C, D, E, and our focal retailer, Chestnut Ridge, these are the averages of the different items. Where it's on a Likert scale, where 1 means perception is poor and 7 means perception is excellent. So we can see here that how we rate on average across all of these different factors. What we notice, though, is there's a lot of cases where there's similarities across the different items. For instance, we might notice that our measure of quality is very similar to our measure of whether or not our items last. And that might be true for other retailers as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to see whether we can collapse all of these items into a few factors that might represent an overall theme. Right? To start doing that, the first thing we want to do is we want to see how many factors might be in our data. So to do that, we're going to run this function that will give us the eigenvalues of these 12 items, so that we can see whether or not there are a certain number of factors. So when we run this, It will print out the eigenvalues for us. We can see any eigenvalue greater than 1, we're going to treat as its own factor. So we see here that there's certainly 1, 2, 3, 4 eigenvalues that are greater than 1. So we're going to say that there exist 4 factors in this data that we're going to collapse these 12 items onto. So the next step is to actually run a factor analysis where we group together these items based on their shared correlations. So there is a function called factor analysis or fact_anal that will give us these factors. So we'll go ahead and run that function. When we run that function, we can see certainly the uniqueness of the different items, but also the loadings of the items. The loadings will tell us what item is loading on what factor. So it seems to be that, for instance, latest, trends, and stylish load very highly on factor 1. There seems to be a small amount of negative loading of value. Quality, last, and fit seem to load highly on factor 2. Satisfied, purchase, and recommend seem to load highly on factor 3. And bargain, a value, bargain, and worth seem to load highly on factor 4, as well as a couple small negative loadings from stylish and latest. Now we could stop at this point and go forward with the results of this factor analysis, but oftentimes what we'll do is we'll now do what's called a factor rotation, where we'll rotate them to sort of maximize the loadings of the items on certain factors and minimize the cross loadings of the factors. So here we have a few cross loadings. So we're going to try a factor rotation. So in the next step, we're going to rotate the factors to try and maximize the loadings on a single factor and minimize the cross loadings across factors. So we'll go ahead and run this, and this will save the result into an object called retailer.fa or factor analysis. All right, so that loaded up into that object. So now we have our result of our factor analysis where we maximize the single factor loadings. Now we could print out the result just like we did before. Another option might be to visualize the result. So we're going to create a heat map where the heat map is actually going to show us which items are loading on which factors. So go ahead and highlight the heat map. What we'll see from the heat map is that we'll see anything that's much darker red, in this case, the way we loaded it, is going to load on a certain factor. So we see here that factor 1 still seems to be trends, stylish, latest. Factor 2 seems to be fit, last, and quality. Factor 3 is the purchase, recommend, and satisfied. And factor 4 is the value, worth, and bargain. So at this point, now that we have these factors, we might want to come up with names for these factors so that we can think about what they mean. So what we'll do is we'll look at the combination of items that load on these factors, and we'll come up with names that we think are representative of those factors. What you'll see down below is that when we do load those things on, we're going to come up with those names. The names that we came up with were that factor 1 might be called innovative, factor 2 might be about quality, factor 3 might be about loyalty, and factor 4 might be about value. So you can pick whatever names you want, but usually you're trying to pick a name that captures the essence of the different items that are loading well onto that factor. So we'll go ahead and aggregate those factor scores by each retailer. So now we'll be able to see which retailer loads highly on which factors. And again, we're going to generate a heat map that will then allow us to audit the various retailer brands. So in this step, we're going to aggregate those factor scores onto the retailers. We can see here that for different retailers, now factor scores, the way they work is that each factor will have a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. So any average factor loading that's above a 0 suggests that that brand is above the average when it comes to loading on that factor. Anything less than 0 would suggest below average. So we can sort of see some different negatives and positives here. it might be easier for us to visualize this. So we'll go ahead and visualize this as similar to that heat map we had before. When we run that, we'll see a factor score by retailer. Now here again, darker means that a higher loading is happening. So we can certainly look at our focal retailer, Chestnut Ridge, and see that it's loading relatively highly on perceptions of innovation and quality, somewhat highly on loyalty, and not so highly on value, which might be okay if we ourselves are positioning as a brand or a retailer that is high quality, innovative, with a good customer base that values what we do, but not necessarily somebody who provides low prices or potentially good value in what we're selling. Now, we can see that other retailers might be even more superior on certain dimensions. So retailer B seems to be perceived to be the highest in terms of innovation. Retailer C seems to be perceived the highest in terms of value. But what this allows us to do now is we can look back and say, we have this positioning strategy of what we believe we are as a retailer. Do these perceptions by these consumers that we survey match well to the perceptions we have of our own brand? If so, then our audit would suggest that we are doing the right things to position ourselves in the market. If there's a mismatch or there's incongruency between these factors and consumer perceptions in terms of our beliefs versus theirs, then it suggests to us we need to do more to make sure we're positioning ourselves correctly in the market. So with this example, you are able to see that even if you ask a survey with a lot of different items, and sometimes those items are very correlated, that what you can do is run a factor analysis to capture these latent factors that represent multiple items at once. And when you name these factors, you can then sort of capture the essence of, in this case, it's a scale that will tell us something about people's perceptions.